Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our first quarter of 2025 DDF Solution Showcase, featuring today two exciting presentations from solution providers in the digital protocol design space. That's data4knowledge and content rules with futurpositif. This webinar is co-sponsored by Transcelerate and CDISC. My name is Mike Rippin. I'm a project manager on the Transcelerate DDF initiative, and I'll be moderating today. Next, please. I just quickly want to go through the agenda for today. Each of the solutions featured today will be presenting for approximately 30 minutes. We'll then conclude with a 30-minute panel discussion, during which time we'll be taking questions and answers. Also joining us for the panel discussion will be Chris Decker, the CEO from CDISC. Next slide, please. So I'd now like to quickly introduce today's presenters. First off, we'll be having Johannes Ulander and Kirsten Walter Langendorf from data4knowledge presenting eProtocol and the USDM from protocol to reality. And then secondly, we'll be having Regina Lynn Preciado from content rules and Todd Georgiev from futurpositif presenting supporting protocol content reuse, starting with USDM. So thank you to everyone who's going to be presenting today. Next, please. Just quickly want to go through some of the basic logistics for the webinar itself today. You will have noticed that all participants will be on mute for today's call. For audio, you can join either through your computer or your phone. So if you have some troubles, there's alternative ways to try and dial in. Thirdly, as far as questions go, we do have a number of questions which we received in advance. So when we get to the panel discussion, we will start with those questions that we've already received. If time permits, however, we will take live questions from the audience. And if you'd like to submit a question, as you can see on the screen here, you can submit one at any time using the icon in the upper right-hand corner of your console that's got the little question mark on it. You click that and you can type your question into the chat box. Finally, we are providing today another link to a downloadable handout. So as you can see here on the screen, you can also find that in the upper right-hand corner of your console, and that one's got a little paper clip on it. So this handout contains a number of useful links to DDF resources, which is especially useful if you're relatively new to DDF initiative and the USDM standard, and it's a good basis for finding out where to go and get the key information to understand more. Next, please. So I want to go through a few ground rules. I am not going to read everything that's on the screen in great detail, but I just want to say a couple of high-level points. We will not be able to answer questions on specific solutions not represented on this call, or we will not be able to answer or provide insights into which organizations are using which solutions, and we won't be able to discuss anything related to pricing or cost. So specifically, if you were to ask questions on those things, those wouldn't be allowed. Okay, next slide, please. So before we move on to the presenters in a minute, I just want to talk a little bit, excuse me, and acknowledge the two organizations who are co-sponsoring the webinar today. So the first is Transcelerate, as we can see on the screen here. So Transcelerate is a not-for-profit entity that was created to foster collaboration across the global pharmaceutical R&D community with the goal of driving efficient, effective, and high-quality delivery of new medicines. And our co-sponsor today, next slide please, is CDISC. And I'm going to ask Chris Decker, the CEO of CDISC, to say a few words on CDISC's behalf.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for everybody joining us today. We're really excited about this webinar as well as future ones where we'll be able to demonstrate the value as we think about digital protocols. So most people on the phone probably already know about CDISC, but we've been around for 25 years developing data standards for clinical research. So we have the spectrum from collection of information in a trial all the way through the analysis of the trial. We have those standards and they're used globally, consensus-based standards that are freely available on our website. And the model which you'll hear a number of the presenters talk about today, the Unified Study Definition Model, the USDM, was built in collaboration with Transcelerate and has been really driving, I think, and transforming the way we think about a protocol and the digital nature of this. Our standards are required both within PMDA and FDA, and are also used by many regulatory agencies throughout the world. So we're excited to be here. We're excited to partner with Transcelerate on this digital protocol initiative, and very interested to watch the demonstrations today. So I'll stop talking and let's move on.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, for that. So just to summarize, Transcelerate and CDISC, we're very excited to co-sponsor this series. As Chris just mentioned, we've been working very closely together on this for the past few years, with Transcelerate playing the role of leading the DDF initiative as a whole, and CDISC leading the development of the USDM standard, which is so foundational to the DDF solution overall. We've been running this series for a couple of years now. We've been able to bring a number of stakeholders together to showcase some of the unique and innovative ways that DDF and USDM standards are being implemented. And today's webinar will continue that story. Next slide, please. So before I turn this over to presenters, I do want to quickly inform everyone that DDF does have a 2-day event later this year in September, which we're going to run in both the US and in Switzerland, with a packed and exciting agenda covering a whole range of DDF topics and USDM. So more details and registration will be made available. So please keep an eye out for that and watch this space. On that note, and without further ado, I would like to turn the mic over to our first presentation today, which will be Data for Knowledge with Johannes and Kirsten. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Now, let's just share my screen. I hope you can see my screen. Yes? All right.
Yes.
So today we will show our technology demonstrator. Our tool demonstrates how we can represent a protocol in USDM. And what we've done, we've made a few additions to that model that then can facilitate a digital data flow end to end. Our tool is not a commercial product, but it can be used for proof of concept or for demonstrating a digital data flow principles. So, who are we? We are 4 persons. Johannes and Justin are located in Sweden, and Dave and myself located in Denmark. We're a small consultancy company, and we have lots of experience in the pharma industry and also use of CDISC standards for many years. And we started the company in 2022. Just a little disclosure, Dave Iverson-Hurst is working on a contract with CDISC as a CDISC USDM product owner. So the views that we are expressing today is not those of CDISC, but something that we will present as DFK. So the agenda, I will give a short introduction before I hand over to Johannes, who will then demo our tool. So first off, point 1, we will load the protocol into USDM, which has a timeline and it has biomedical concepts. And these are core elements in the study SOA schedule of activities. And it's a very core element of USDM. Then we introduce some additions, the data contract, which is a unique identifier for all the data points that we plan to collect in the study. And this enables us to make study form and define that XML. And from the USDM, we can also extract to our design domains that Johannes will show you. Then we will also demonstrate that we can add some subject data. And immediately after that, we can then show that data in STM format with full traceability. So that's kind of the outline of the demo that Johannes will show. A little bit of background. We have been talking about end-to-end for a long time. It's been on agendas for many years. Many attempts have been made along the way for trying to make end-to-end automation. But we think with DDF, USDM, Web11, CDISC 360i, especially the USDM being matured, we see the standards coming together and making this desire for automation a possibility. So we have, here we have the USDM model. All the light green ones are USDM. And we load in the protocol. That was this item number 1 here in the demo that we're going to show. We load it in. And the key element is, of course, there's a lot of other bits and pieces of USDM, but we will focus, you can say, mostly on the SOA. And if we look at this, we have the timelines. This is part of the USDM as well. We have the activities and the BCs as well over here. And the USDM allows us to represent this electronically and a lot better because we have the details from the biomed concepts, and it introduces this more granular level with the BCs, and it detailing exactly what we are collecting. For instance, here we have, the unit and the result and the date time and so forth. So that's the power also of the BCs in that SOA. So after we loaded the protocol, we will then extend the model. So we add this data contract, and the data contract is related to the BC properties and to the so-called scheduled activity instances, which kind of represents the timing of the activities. And the data contract can be thought of like a barcode, or as we said, a unique identifier. And it kind of represents the set of data points that is needed to meet the needs of the study, the data point that we need to collect, and expands the SOA even further. And what we have is that we have a URI, a unique identifier. It's like this barcode that kind of represent where that single data point needs to go into. And it can be used for multiple purposes, also external data providers and long-term retention of the data. So we have a unique identifier of those data points that we collect. What we then do is that we add subjects here. This is the subject and the data points. So we ask the data providers to give us the data, basically just the subject and the value, and then this data contract. And then we can add that directly into the model here again. What we then do, we also have we have loaded in the SDTM model here. We have the model, the IG, and its class variables. And then we have what we call our connector model, which is our clinical recording model, our extension, that is, you can say, represents a relationship. We make generic relationships between the BC properties via this model to a exporting model, you can say. We could load in multiple versions of SDTM, all as indicated over here in the circle here. We can also have FHIR, we can have OMOP, we could load in other models. But these models exist over here, and we just connect it back to this connector model. And that allows us to represent the data that we have in various formats for downstream processing. So enough of slides. I would like to hand over to you, Hannes.
Thank you, Kirsten. I will take over and I will start with the slides. So we made this technology demonstrator because the true or real impact of how the ICH M11 and the USDM will change our industry, it's not really understandable unless you see it in action. So we decided to make this technology demonstrator so you can actually understand and start thinking about, because the potential is so big that it's and I keep coming up with new use cases all the time. So therefore we have this technology demonstrator, which it's no fancy technology. It's just, I'm running it on a laptop at the moment using a graph database. It has a very basic user interface, but I mean, how pretty it looks, it's not the thing. It's what I actually can produce with this model as a solid foundation. And we're continuing to work on it to just, again, trying to implement new use cases when we can come up with or get ideas from others. So this is a demo, and I don't want to bore you with how boring it looks to just load the protocol itself. I'm just going to, if maybe some of you have been part of the Transcelerate USDM workshops at Fuse or CDISC, then you have probably already seen this Excel spreadsheet, which is the source of of all of this. And this is the old CDISC pilot study that was given from Eli Lilly to CDISC as an example of a typical STTM submission data. And that protocol that was underlined, because both the protocol and the data was part of this CDISC pilot study. So this is just turning that PDF into an Excel spreadsheet, which I'm now going to load into the tool and make USDM of it. So go into the right place. So it will not be very fancy. I'm just clicking here. You can see that there's no studies within my database at the moment. So I'm going to load the protocol, just select the appropriate file. And again, it's the CDISC pilot study. And then start loading this, process the file and upload it into the database. And so this upload process will now create all the timelines, all the activities, the biomedical concepts and STTM, and create the data contracts. So I can view the versions of the study and then view the different study designs, because USDM supports versioning. And now we're looking at that design that I just loaded from my Excel spreadsheet. So now you can see I have some data contracts, I have some subject data, but that's everything. So I will switch over to live demonstration. I hope that you can see this all right. So here's the main design. Here are all the timelines. USDM supports multiple timelines, and reason for that is because everybody who has been creating your own schedule of assessments or activities for a protocol, you know that it's really hard to bring the complexity of a clinical trial into a two-dimensional Excel spreadsheet or table in a Word document. So we can avoid things like having all of these crosses for adverse events, which we are capturing all the time during the course of a clinical trial, and split them up into sort of neat little packages that contain all the information that we need. So if I look at the main timeline, you have all the timing information on the top, just like a normal SOA, but then I have all the activities on the left and then the usual crosses. But then we have also added the biomedical concepts. So here for informed consent, we have a biomedical concept, informed consent obtained. And if I look at demographics, we have date of birth, sex rates, and so forth. And we also have clinical chemistry, lots of biomedical concepts. But more importantly, we also have this sub-timeline of vital signs, because for this study, we want to make sure that we're collecting the vital signs measurements in the procedure that in the correct order. So for here, we now have biomedical concepts again for vital signs. So we're going to make the subject supine, then we're going to collect diastolic blood pressure, systolic blood pressure, heart rate. We're going to make the subject stand, and then while the subject is standing, we're then going to collect these biomedical concepts again, and then make them stand for 5 minutes or something. And then we will collect this information again. So you can see that we can really get into a very detailed level, which are usually exposed as footnotes or something else, extra comment columns in a regular traditional protocol. So the timeline is really detailed. And then we add these data contracts. And they're not very much to look at. I mean, it's basically just a unique identifier that points to a specific BC and a specific property, and then at a specific time point on the timeline. And I will show a little bit more of that when I go through the demonstration. So what can you now do that you have the timelines in USDM and I have the data contracts? Well, first of all, I can start showing you the forms. So just by using the relationship between the biomedical concepts to the appropriate place in the timeline, I can now show you how an example of a CRF would look like. So on the left side, you have kind of a CRF form layout. On the right side, you can see the biomedical concept in itself in the graph view. And if you see them side by side, I mean, it's not really hard to see that for this position, I'm now having standing and sitting and supine. And that's also exactly what I'm just displaying here on the left side in the form view. So same information, just displayed in a different way. You can also notice here that these are all the visits for which this information is going to be collected. So this is sort of a what's it called? The big design of the trial itself. But I can also look at this from another perspective. So I can actually create the defined document. So the good thing with the graph is that it depends on where you start traversing it, which information you will get. So if I now looked from the BC side of things and show to which visits and then to which STTM domains, I'm not sure I said that I also had the STTM annotation on the forms as well. But now I'm just traversing the graph from the other side. So now I'm looking at it from the STTM side of things. So here I'm listing the data sets. And if I go to the vital signs domain, I have all the value level metadata. So for example, if I'm going to collect height, I'm going to use the unit centimeter, inch, and meter. If it's weight, I'm using gram, kilograms, or pound, because again, it's all part of the BC. The BC is the definition of the data points that I'm going to collect for this trial. So let's go back. What I also can do is, again, I have the BCs, I know when I'm going to collect them, so why not just make a draft lab transfer specification? So, I mean, again, I'm just displaying the same information in a new way. And in this case, it is for building up my contracts with my vendors. And actually, you can add any kind of information and attach it to the BC. So you could add, for example, the cost of the total lab transfer specification per subject, for example. So you can add a lot of extra information here, which you might need for when you're designing your study. I can also show the activities by encounter or visit. So here I'm just listing all the different visits in the study. And underneath I have the the activities that are for this specific visit. And what I've heard from data management people I'm talking to, I mean, you want to make it easy for your sites to actually perform the study. And I mean, so this is almost like a Google Maps of directions, saying that for screening at, okay, I'm going to do the informed consent first, and I'm going to do the inclusion/exclusion criteria. I'm going to assign the patient number and so forth. So it will be sort of a map over how the trial looks. And if I want to, I can also include the biomedical concepts, but it's very hard to read. But I mean, all the detail is part of USDM, and which is sort of in the basis, in the foundation of USDM. We also have the STTM trial design domains, but there's no real reason to use them. I mean, because if we have USDM, all of the trial design domains are already in there. So I can just produce my trial arms. Remember, I have only loaded the protocol into my database. That's all I have. But I can still create my trial arms dataset. I can view my trial elements. I can view my trial visits. And of course, trial inclusion and exclusion criteria. Because this is already part of the USDM. And if you're wondering about STTM, you can see it here. And the reason why it's here is because the BCs are linked to the domains. So it's not the other way around. The BCs themselves are agnostic about, or they don't know anything about STTM. But I can have them as an output format if I link them to the BCs. So I can list the domains they're going to use because the BCs are part of the design of the study, but there is no data here. But I can start just creating a new subject. So I'm going to make a subject, and I can start again following or traversing the schedule of assessments of the loaded trial. Not much I can do for the informed consent. I'm going to consent for it right now. But you see here that it says next activity is collection for date of birth. And how can I know that? Well, again, I'm just looking at the schedule of assessments in the appropriate order that is defined according to the USDM. So I'm saving here, and then my next collection should be birth date. And since I want to be, I don't want to disclose my appropriate age because I would actually be allowed to participate in this trial. So I'm going to put 1976 and save. And then I'm making a note here from the database saying that age of the subject is 49. Remember that subjects need to be older than 50 to be included in the study. I didn't show you the inclusion criteria, but again, I have loaded the inclusion and exclusion criteria into this database, so it already knows what age the subject should be able to participate. I'm not going to do much more than it, but I'm just showing that you can also build checks upon your inclusion exclusion criteria directly from the protocol. Next one is the self-reported sex, and I'll just put male and then save, and then I go to the next one, which is race, which is always this funny question. If I have any programmers in the you know what I'm talking about with these other questions and multiple options. And I know that this is not a race, but I'm allowed to report whatever I want in a clinical trial. So I'm going to write Swedish, and I'm going to save. So if I now go back to my STTM data and I look into my STTM domain for demographics, you can now see that it has data in it. So I have an informed consent date, I have a birth date, and I have the derived age, I have the sex, and then it says multiple here over at race. Because I have already pre-populated the race 1 and race 2, which you need to do when you create your STTM dataset. I'm going to click on Swedish now and see what happens. The data points are also URIs. They are unique things within the database. So I clicked on the Swedish, and that's why this Swedish value is now highlighted here in the graph view. But you can also see that I have the white here, and you see that in the graph, it doesn't really care about all the problems we have with representing data in a tabular format. I still have full control of it because it always have this single identity. And you can also notice here that since the BC has had this 5 different, I think it's 5 or 6 different terminology values to be used, this already knows from the BC that the Swedish it got is not part of the code list that is attached to the biomedical concept. So I can also flag it and say that who you actually got a value here that's not part of the code list. So in some sense, it's kind of a validation of the data already from the protocol and the BC. But what you also want to do is, of course, you will be able to load new data or old data in this case. So I mean, we have, since we had the CDIS pilot data available, I've also made a load file. So I'm going to load in some of this data. So now it's not in STTM format. It was STTM format from the start, but I have made it more raw data-like, and now I can upload this information into the database. So now I have 11 subjects. I've added 10 more. And if I then go into my demographics data set, you can see that I have new subjects here from the pilot study. Okay, I got a question here. I'm not sure how I'm going to remove that from the screen. But you see, I also have this, again, my data. And the loaded data is, again, now in graph format, and I have it as unique identifiers for the data points, and I have full control and traceability for how it was collected. So I'm just going to show you the subject data and what that actually looks like, because it's quite different in the graph world. Because what we actually need is the data point and the data contract URI. We need a value and we need a time point. That's all we need. So this site, this subject, this biomedical concept, the property of it, and then the value are linked together with this data contract URI. So if I click this data contract URI, it will take you to the graph again, and it will tell you what it represents. So this data contract represents the screening visit, which is happening 2 weeks before the baseline visit. And this is the birth date in the biomedical concept, date of birth. And I'm going to take one of the loaded subjects as well, and this can be a bit tricky. I hope this works. Cross your fingers again. It has a data contract, and this is for adverse events. It's for the action taken property. And you see that it's in an unscheduled visit. So I can actually store information that is not part of the scheduled assessment, because you know adverse events can be captured at any time during the course of the trial. But it still exists, it still has the data contract, and I have full control over my information. So you have now seen me. I'm going to go back to there. I have shown you the annotated CRF, the defined XML. I could also create a draft lab transfer specification. I could show you all the activities by visits. I showed you the trial design domains. I could make data capture. I could also import raw data, and I could also expose this as STTM data by just using USDM as the foundation. So USDM provides a really strong foundation for how you can actually specify to a very detailed level your clinical trials. The study can be in there, and it has huge potential. And we have now just showed you some of the use cases, but there are multiple other use cases which you can just dream up with, which I would, for 5 years ago, I would never have dreamt that I can actually do this. We did extend the USDM a little bit to establish the data contract and we linked in the subject data, and we linked in STTM, which then provided the opportunity to do the data capture, extract STTM, HRF, and define XML, and so forth. And we will continue to work on this, our technology demonstrator, but nothing of it would be possible without the USDM standard. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Johan and Kirsten. That was a very interesting discussion, and it was great to hear about ANSI demonstration on the data contract and connector model notions, and how USDM can be extended to seamlessly support all those downstream connection points that you described very well there. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to turn it over to our second solution feature today, and hand over to Regina and Todd. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Johannes and Kirsten, for setting us up very, very nicely for what I hope you'll find to be a very complimentary presentation. Regina and I are going to be talking to you today about supporting the protocol content reuse, and starting with USDM and how USDM lays a foundation for that. And I'd say the key word for that is content. The key word in our title is content, and what we're really referring to is the narrative content in the protocol, which is very complementary to the structured content that Kirsten and Johannes were mostly referring to. So my name is Todd Georgiev. My consulting work is under the name of futurpositif. That's what futurpositif is. I've been around the DDF community for 6 years, almost exactly 6 years now, including leading a couple of work streams with digital data flow. I'm a former program lead for Transcelerate at Roche, which I think will be a little bit relevant later on, because I started as the program lead while the adoption of the Transcelerate common protocol template was a thing, while it was being broadly adopted across the industry. And I currently have doing a lot of work around data interoperability, including work on patient clinical trial matching, which kind of helps to explain how I've become so interested in structuring the narrative components of the protocol, including things like eligibility criteria, because the patient clinical trial matching challenge, spoiler alert, ends up starting with semantic interoperability challenge as well. So that's a little bit about where I'm coming from. I'll hand it over to Regina to introduce herself.
Thanks, Todd. Hi, I'm Regina Lynn Preciado. I am the Senior Director of Content Strategy Solutions at Content Rules. And Content Rules is a consultancy, and we work in the content space. We solve complex content challenges. So I come to protocols, clinical, and actually other submission content from a content background. For the past 10 to 12 years, I've really focused in on life sciences. And I'm excited to talk with everyone today because my background in structured content marries really nicely with everything that CDISC and the standard organizations are doing to help make narrative content machine friendly so we can treat it more like data. So thank you, Todd. I'll hand to you to start.
Great, thank you. So just as a quick outline, I'm going to start today by setting a bit of context around sort of the information challenge that clinical trials ecosystem poses, particularly starting with the protocol. I'll be articulating the problem statement as well as the impact that the problem that we sets up in the ecosystem. Then we'll be sharing the objective for the work that Regina and I have been doing around the gap analysis that we'll be presenting to you later on. Despite the fact that that USDM represents a great advance in terms of setting us up for protocol narrative content reuse, we think that there's still an opportunity that ahead of us. Regina will then present the results of our gap analysis, and then we'll have a couple of concluding comments to share with you to wrap up. So by way of introduction, everyone on this call is acutely aware of the fact that clinical trials require extensive information sharing across the enterprise, across stakeholders, and across different platforms. That information is a combination of raw data. And when I talk about raw data, I'm thinking about sort of discrete data points like time points, like ages, like dosages, as well as summarized data that are captured, that are represented in things like activities, physical exam concepts, those kinds of things as well. But then what we're going to focus on today is largely about sort of the rest of the protocol. And significant amounts of study protocols consist of narrative text and narrative content that are, large blocks of text, for example, in paragraphs that are, descriptions of rationales, descriptions of safety considerations, rationales for study schemas and study designs, for example. Now, the Digital Data Flow Initiative makes that raw and summarized data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I think the work that D4K and Kirsten and Johannes presented to us a moment ago is a great example of how that information can be leveraged in using the USDM Foundation. What we want to share with you today is how the DDF principles can also apply to the narrative content in the protocols as well. So the problem statement is the fact that, as I mentioned, study protocols contain narrative content in machine-incompatible formats. So traditional formats like Microsoft Word documents and PDF documents, for example, contain unstructured text, which really limit the ability for us to leverage that information for automation, automated reuse, as well as for integration and the foundational large language model and AI models that we're all becoming much more interested in these days. So unstructured documents, it turns out, are the least effective way to create, manage, and publish that narrative content as well. So what we wanted to present you today is an opportunity to shift that a little bit. And whether we're talking about configuring an electronic data capture or another data capture system, or whether we're talking about writing a lab manual or a lay representation of protocol information, such as an informed consent form or a manual or a registry listing, for example, all of that ineffective use of time could be shifted by better structuring the narrative content in protocol. The need to do transcription can also introduce errors. Transcription and recreation of the narrative content can also introduce the possibility for errors and the risk that we are introducing errors in transcription and translation during the workflow. And then finally, as I mentioned, with all of us becoming more interested in the use of generative AI, unstructured documents end up being a fairly poor resource for training large language models and retrieval augmented generation schemas, which rely on optimizing large language models by using an authoritative knowledge base of training data to generate better responses. So by adopting some of the practices about structuring that narrative content, we're really helping to optimize our chances of using large language models and generative AI more effectively. So the objective that we had was to conduct a bit of a gap analysis by looking at USDM. And while USDM, particularly USDM versions 3 and 4, are quite an advance, quite a step forward in terms of setting us up for content reuse, and I'll explain how that is in a moment, we think that there is an opportunity to look at the use of things like semantic XML, particularly open standard XML formats, to mark up that content to make it even more flexible and more extensible rather than the XHTML that's being used now. So as I mentioned, we think that USDM version 3 and 4, we acknowledge that they include, those versions of the USDM include elements that really account for the narrative content. So for example, when you dive deeply into the USDM, you'll find out, you'll find reference to syntax templates that will allow for the creation of reusable blocks of text, particularly larger blocks of text like an entire eligibility criterion or entire paragraph, for example, of narrative content. The USDM goes further by acknowledging the use or allowing for the use of XHTML tags that indicate structure, context, syntax, and those attributes can then also be mapped to other aspects in the USDM, including the biomedical concepts that Johannes did a great job and Kristen did a great job explaining to us. And the USDM also allows for the insertion of those tags within the narrative sections as well. So you can further break down those narrative sections into some of the more usable componentized formats as well. However, despite that, we think that there's still an opportunity to structure and mark up the narrative information with semantic XML. Because while the XHTML tags are fairly rich, XML is both more flexible and more extensible than XHTML as a markup language or markup standards. So that sort of explains why we wanted to do the gap analysis to see how we could better set up that narrative content in the protocols for reuse across things like submission documents, for extracting verbatim content for registry listings, for example, and then, as I mentioned before, structuring it for optimizing generative AI applications for summaries and derivative content, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. So for those of you who have been paying attention to Transcelerate for the past few years, this will sound very familiar. In some ways, what we're doing is we're kind of coming full circle back to the origin story of the Digital Data Flow Initiative. I borrowed this figure from the implementation support resource from the Clinical Content and Reuse initiative from Transcelerate as well, which excuse me, evolved to explain how content in the protocol can be reused in downstream information assets like the statistical analysis plan and the clinical study report. And this kind of formed the origin story of digital data flow, because while Transcelerate was working on things like the electronic template suite, we came to the realization that we could leverage some of that protocol information, some of the data points that we've talked about and the biomedical concepts that we've talked about to configure downstream data collection systems. So by highlighting the ability to also structure some of that narrative text component of the protocol, what we're doing is we're sort of coming back and tech enabling some of the content reuse, which was really where we started with the whole thing. And to dive a little bit deeper, to taking that idea of content reuse a little bit further, if I follow down the sort of vertical axis here, you look at the fact that the protocol is sort of the origin of a lot of the narrative text that reappears often with only, for example, a verb text change reappears in things like the clinical study report or the statistical analysis plan, and those all kind of term verbatim reuse. So if I move from top to bottom, I'm kind of copying and pasting, or hopefully not copying and pasting, but automating the verbatim reuse of some of the protocol narrative sections in the CSR and then eventually even in the common technical document that will form the basis for the submission to health authorities. And then off to the right and to the left, you've got things like informed consent forms, plain language summaries, and in some cases even registry listings, where we are doing some translations of those into either lay language or even foreign language translations. So by structuring that protocol narrative content in a more optimal way, I'm also setting myself up for better derivative reuse using things like generative AI or even more manual processes to create that derivative content. So that kind of sets the table for the gap analysis that we wanted to do to compare the use of something like XHTML to something like XML. And what I'll do is I'll hand it over now to Regina to walk us through the gap analysis that we executed.
Thanks, Todd. And I know you're still driving the deck, so I'll just tell you next slide.
I'll be listening.
There we go. So when we were coming up with the criteria for our gap analysis, we were really looking at this question of how do we make narrative content more like data or more machine friendly like well-structured data. So, and we were comparing the traditional word processing documents with a document management system against more of a structured content system that breaks the content into components that then get assembled into different, in this case, document outputs. So we looked at, can you apply metadata at the full document level? Metadata could be the protocol ID, some of those study characteristics, like what phase is it, and so on. And yes, in both systems, both the traditional way and a more modern way of handling content, you can do that. When we looked at the next stage, which was, can we apply metadata to a more granular set of information? So a chunk of information. That's not really possible in just word processing documents, but it is what the structured content is set up to do. We looked at whether we're very metadata focused in the beginning. Can we apply the clinically relevant semantic metadata to source components? Semantic means meaning and meaningful. So you'll see this. We have some examples after this overview of how the USDM provides that meaningful language that helps us tag content in a way that makes sense to humans and also makes it very machine friendly, processable by machines. We looked at just the general capabilities of capturing knowledge and creating outputs from that knowledge. Traditionally, we do documents, but we're really starting to see other formats like the registries or the label, the EPI, that where you can view a drug label in HTML on the web and so on. So we were looking at basic content management and publishing capabilities. We wanted to see if we could provide curated, semantically tagged, so meaningfully tagged chunks of narrative content to train an AI solution. And again, the word processing document, not very good at that. But if we start structuring the content and thinking about it more as chunks of information, components of information with some meaningful markup, then yes, we start to move towards a way of making narrative content more machine friendly. We looked at, can you automatically generate content from some kind of source text? Because a lot of companies right now are experimenting with and starting to operationalize these use of Gen AI assistants that sort of sit there in a sidebar. And whether you're writing in a word processing document like Microsoft Word or Google Docs or something, or you're working in a more structured system, these AI tools are available to writers today. So that one in the gap analysis, both systems got that. We looked at automated content reuse. And so that, again, going back to that Transcelerate reuse map, where we know we describe the study design in many different just documents today, from the lab manuals to obviously the protocol. The CSR repeats it. The informed consent forms has a layperson friendly version of this. So we looked at the automation of content reuse across these two ways of producing documents. And finally, we looked at just general authoring. Yes, you can author in word processing documents. You can author in structured content. So those were our 8 criteria that we were judging, that we were looking at in this experiment. So Todd, go ahead in the next slide. So real quick, word processing, when I'm talking about semantic meaningful markup a lot. So I want to back up and say one of the weaknesses we have in our traditional document world is it's not meaningful. We are quote unquote tagging our content, but it's all about formatting. So we can say this is a heading 1 or a heading 2, or this paragraph is a normal style. And, that's easy to kind of mess up and then someone has to fix it. But it makes it challenging for machines. Even with content that's as standardized as a protocol, we've had to take extra steps to train machines to look for What's the difference between a study rationale and a study design? They both say heading 2. Next slide. Thank you. So when we looked at the USDM, which is providing us with a meaningful vocabulary to indicate the content by its type rather than just its format. Because of course, what it looks like in a PDF is not the same as what it looks like in a browser. So if we can tag the content for the machine to say, here's the study rationale, and it should look like this in a PDF, and it should look like that in a registry, and it should look like that in a lab manual, then we start to be able to process this narrative content in many different ways without a human having to redo anything, no copy paste and no reformatting. Todd, next slide. And next slide. So we have some examples. I just want to set some context. We were comparing format-based markup to meaningful semantic markup. And we really wanted to illustrate this with some XML, but this is not intended to be working XML. It is purely for illustration. So Todd, next slide. We'll look at the first example. Thank you for driving. So on the left, we have from that Transliterate study and the CDISC study that Eli Lilly donated for these purposes. We have a paragraph from the protocol. And as you can see, it's a dense wall of text with lots of crucial information. Todd and I split it out really granularly and tagged it with the USDM attributes to say, you know what's in this paragraph? We have a description of the treatment. We have a description of a summary of symptoms. We have a description of what emergency treatment could happen. We describe injections. We describe challenges with injections. There's a possibility of what happens if you can't use needles. And finally, we describe the actual formulation that the study is about. So that is a lot of information to cram into one paragraph, and the writers did a great job of putting that all in there. Todd, next slide, please. Because I know it's hard to see. So the next slide does a close-up where you can see that just this first sentence is the definition of the condition that this drug is going to treat. So by tagging that first sentence with the definition, we start to already be able to tell machines for machine processing, hey, here's a definition. And anywhere we want to define this condition throughout all the related documentation that goes with this study, we should say the same thing, the same way. And here is a way to make this more retrievable. Next slide. We have another example. In this is from the study design section. And again, I know it's a little bit small, but you can see there is just a paragraph of text on the left. And on the right, we went very granular and we split out what information is this summary paragraph showing. Well, it's showing or it's describing the study phase, characteristics, the activities that are going to happen in these periods of time, and then the randomization process at the end. Todd, next slide. We have a close-up on the next slide to show that the randomization process might be information that we need to include, maybe in an informed consent, or maybe we just need to look it up, or the AI needs to retrieve it. So by tagging that last bit with a meaningful tag, randomization process, it makes this much easier to find and easier to process. Next slide, please. The third example is about eligibility criteria. And Todd, you can advance to the close-up on the next piece, because I think people are getting the idea. So again, with our inclusion criteria, we can show that we can indicate that this is the narrative text about inclusion criteria. So this is very complementary to the specific, maybe standardized descriptions of our inclusion criteria. And again, this is to illustrate the markup possibilities that the USDM provides for helping us get this content identified by its job or its purpose, not just what it looks like. Next slide. I'm keeping Todd on his toes. So what are the requirements then? Where I keep talking about making the narrative content more machine processable. So these are requirements for making the content automatable. Number one, for effective machine processing, the narrative content needs to be tagged with consistent, unique, and meaningful metadata. And by unique, we mean if you call something study definition, that's what it is. You can't call something else study definition. So we are going to be tagging our content. The authors don't have to see this. Most of the tools hide this tagging behind a very nice user interface, but the machines need to see this tagging. So two, to treat narrative content like it's data, it needs to be tagged much more granularly than even that section level. Just calling it study design is too big. The machine, to do effective content reuse and automate, we really need to pull out, well, what is the design? It's a phase what? It has this, it has that. We did find in our analysis that the USDM provides a common vocabulary for applying semantic markup based on meaning, not the appearance of the content. And I've been working through the latest USDM version 4 is out for public comment and review right now. And I've been working through it, and it is even more granular than version 3, and it's more than adequate for tagging this information. So, there's no reason to go off and come up with some other type of tagging. We have a common standard here that we can start really building to and making our narrative content findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, just like our more obvious data. And the line, I'm going to use air quotes again, the line between content and data is more of a gradient in this context. So we're thinking of the narrative as what we're putting in this documentation for our submissions and for our archives and records. So, and then finally, so the step 4, the USDM metadata vocabulary really helps identify that narrative content, which enables systems to treat that content like data for machine processing. And Todd, the next slide. So our conclusion that we came to, and Todd, if you want to pop back on and speak to the conclusion as well, we did find that unstructured text limited our ability for machine processing. There were some things we could do with it, and the tools have certainly gotten more sophisticated, but you're still left with copy and paste and manual, and the inability to take a unit of narrative content and use it everywhere that information needs to go. And by applying semantic markup, we were able to help machines identify the content by its type and its purpose, and it could be formatted in different ways in, downstream. And finally, that the more granular our markup is, it really enhances our search and reuse and retrieval, and the USDM really provides a good standard for that. And so that was our result. Todd, did you want to add anything on our conclusion?
No, nothing really to add, but I guess what I'd do is amplify the one phrase that you use, which is sort of moving from what amounts to like a wall of text and being able to, extract structured concepts out of that wall of text and then tag those individual discrete concepts so that they can also be reused and leveraged in downstream systems and information products as well. And that's what we were going for. So making sure that the textual components of a clinical trial protocol, which, if you count pages, could represent even the majority of the document, can also be leveraged in the same way that the more structured concepts as well can be in things like biomedical concepts and time points and data points and those kinds of things as well. So everybody's in the game now. the whole
Yes,
every page of the protocol is now in the reuse game.
exactly. And for as long as we may still be providing information as documents, which humans like documents, we've had them for centuries, but also to be able to pull this information out into other ways of consumption. And I think as we get further and further into AI as helping us search, retrieve, and generate answers, this is going to become even more crucial. So thank you. Back to you, Mike.
Well, thank you so much, Regina and Todd, for that very interesting presentation and for explaining a really quite powerful way to extend the USDM to further support content reuse through semantic markup, and particularly, I think, the support for the machine processing and generative AI, which is all the rage nowadays. So next, we're on the presenter Q&A. Excellent. So we've concluded our two formal presentations for today. So we do want to continue now with our panel discussion. So I verify all of our panelists are on camera with your microphones at the ready. Now, we did receive a fair few questions in advance of the webinar today. So I will start with a few of those. And if time permits, we can pick up a few live questions because a few of those did come in as the presentations were rolling today. So the first question is one we receive a lot anyway, especially for those who are new to DDF and the USDM. And I'm actually going to direct this one initially at Chris Decker from CDISC to address this question, which is the following. What level of adoption does the USDM have currently, and what are the blockers to more widespread adoption? So that question for Chris.
Wow. Start me with an easy one, Mike. We talked about having a softball question first, and that didn't work well. It's a great question. It's one we do get frequently. I'm going to give my answer, but if others want to chime in, especially those that are actually, in the weeds doing this, and two great presentations, by the way, really understanding that. I think as we think about USDM and what people are starting to do, there's a couple pieces. There's the people transformation. As Regina said, we've had decades of documents, and trying to transform mindsets into this process is sometimes challenging. But I think what we're seeing with USDM is, as with any new thing that comes along, the first couple iterations of it are almost, if you think about software, right, you almost go through an alpha and a beta phase of work as you start to evolve this. And I think as we were doing that, we were learning, and some organizations were out in front of that, right? As you get out in front of it and you become a leader, you also feel the pains, right, of implementing something new. As we've reached V3 and V4, as Todd said, we now have what we believe is a robust production version of USDM. And what we're finding is organizations sort of taking bits and pieces. So instead of trying to, I'll use a cliche, eat the whole elephant, right? What we see them is taking pieces of that. And I think you saw that from Johannes and Kirsten, how they're tackling a piece of it, right, and driving that piece forward instead of the whole thing. I think one of the key parts is, as we've stabilized the model and we have a production model, and we don't have as much of that sort of backward compatibility or forward compatibility issue, we're going to see vendors continue to adopt this. And what I've seen over the last probably 3 or 4 months is so many vendors coming to us and to Transliterate saying, okay, how do we get on board with this, right? So obviously their clients are telling them we need to move forward in this direction. How do we do that? So I think what we're seeing, I made a short answer long, but as people adopt this, they're doing it in pieces as they go forward in this, and finding the use cases that make the most sense from a value after perspective today. But there's definitely this significant increase in this that we're seeing, both within vendor community as well as within within sponsors. So I don't know, others who have actually rolled their sleeves up and did this. Any input into that?
Yes, Chris. Actually, I am working on a project right now where we're automating some informed consent form authoring, which, as you know, multiple languages, lots of nuances in different countries and different sites. And so we have attributes on our content that we call conditions, which is under what condition do I include this piece of content? And we have used the USDM as our vocabulary for all of those conditional attributes which again is not something I've built into software. I'm using existing software capabilities where you can define what are your conditional attributes and what are the rules for including content that meets certain conditions. So far, the USDM has had an answer for each of the types of information we need to include. So I am on a project where we're using this today in, I'm going to say, like the easiest way, because we're not having to develop software. We're not having to invent or reinvent anything. We're using just the basic vocabulary, but that gives us a very consistent and known centralized way to identify types of content, and then we'll be able to build other things around that over time, and we won't have to nobody has to go into well, what are we going to call that either, which, as you know, can take a lot of time.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, Regina. Any more comments from the rest of the panel on this question?
I think, I think the automation end to end for us, the SOA is quite important, and I think some of the hurdles, as opposed to the way that we work today in documents, I think the way we work in documents, sometimes a lot of is unsaid or undocumented in some ways. Sometimes you just refer to devices or something that you are collecting. But the USDM, if you really want automation, you need to be explicit about it and have it in the USDM so it can drive the automation. And I think that may need a little bit of educational processing there to have people understand the importance of it's not just making a document, it's also downstream processing if this is where we're going. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I could add to that as well, because I think that our mindset is still very document focused. So we don't, I mean, just like Regina said, I mean, so far they have tried to find out, try to solve their problems. And so far, USDM has not made them sad. I mean, they can actually solve it. It's in there. So, I mean, the amount of effort that has gone into this standard and the way you can actually store in a digitized format everything that you need to put in the protocol is quite extraordinary. And I mean, so the old way of working where, I mean, for as long as I've been working, the document or protocol template has changed within each organization I've been using. And it's going smaller, you make a study outline and so forth. And I mean, you're spreading the information out to different documents and then you merge it back together and you never really get the full piece in one central source of truth. But today we actually have USDM that will become this single source of truth for the full protocol, which is, So I think it's, things will happen, it will take some time, but I mean, the foundation for actually doing this, it's there now.
Great, thanks everyone for those responses. I'm going to ask a slightly different question now, which digs a little bit more into the real world value of USDM, and I think it aligns well with the two presentations we had today. So the question is the following, and I'm going to pitch this at our presenting teams today primarily. How can digital protocol elements be utilized to compare clinical trial protocols to standard of care in terms of patient burden, potential benefits, and other operational characteristics of the trial? So I want to open that up and ask our presenting teams initially how they might address that question.
I can give a go. Johannes can supplement because you did an implementation of that. But we can, as also Johannes demonstrated, you can see, for instance, the patient journey that Johannes had in his UI about what is the next thing you need to do. So you can envision that you have a dashboard for the study participants, so they get a diary of when they need to be in the study. You could also make some sort of estimate based on the whole USDM timeline stuff, how long a patient will be in the clinic.
I can add to that as well, because there was a component of the question that was referring a little bit to standard of care as well. And I think that there's some important work that's going on in the background through the partnership of transcelerate in CDISC with HL7 Fire through the Vulkan accelerator, for example, sort of extending the utility of HL7 Fire data standards to the clinical research domain. And I think that level of, or the level of semantic interoperability that the Vulkan accelerator is going to enable will also help us to understand how are patients being treated now kind of in the real world, and how do we, compare the protocol schemas and the protocol designs and the treatment regimens that are being designed into protocols. How do they compare, and what does the delta look like between that and what the protocol is requiring as well? So I think a lot of the work that we're doing is very enabling to that kind of thing. And then the ability to connect some of those structured concepts, like the assessments, for example, how do you connect that to like a costing model or a patient burden model, whether it's looking at time or administrative handovers or what have you. But the starting point for all of that, being able to make those computations, is being able to have that well-structured and well-identified sort of semantic concept in that we can pull out of the protocol to enable that downstream calculation.
Mike, I think
Mike, you're on mute.
My apologies. Yeah, so thanks everyone for those responses. I'm going to jump to a question we did receive in our live chat, because I think it can follow the same theme of where we're going. So again, this is for the two presenting organizations, and it goes like this: do any of these options or solutions enable curation of standard content?
We are so glad you asked that question.
I mean, the USDM is a representation of a study, and you would expect that you would have, a library where you pull from. We have the CDISC-BC library that we pull from. We have terminology. We have all kinds of things, and obviously you could, if the question is about, well, I heard it is about curation of standard content, which is more, building up your library, which is a different matter, if I understood the question correctly.
Yeah, and I also think that it goes into what Regina and Todd presented as well, because all of the content of the protocol is now possible to curate to a higher degree. So the potential for actually reusing content, be able to specify a thing at one specific place in the library, for example, and then reuse it, like inclusion exclusion criteria or other sections of document of the protocol.
That was exactly
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Kirsten. Yeah, that was exactly where I wanted to go with it as well, to be able to say, how many ways should there be to describe that, metastatic non-small cells, stage 3 lung cancer, and could we eventually structure those individual eligibility criteria and use that structured content to populate a library to enable component content reuse as well, and to manage those content elements in a componentized way. But it all starts with being able to represent and extract some of those discrete clinical concepts and being able to know what it is that you're curating in that library.
Yes. And I think in the past, what we've had to do is create the content for every different audience in every different format in every different permutation. And what we can do when we structure and componentize and have standardized libraries of this is start creating it in one place. And we've been talking internally a lot about knowledge capture. So we capture the knowledge in one place, and then you make it available to all the different areas and people and audiences who need it. And I think one interesting thing that has happened when we're all experimenting with Gen AI is the results can only be as good as the source, of course. And so you start to see, if you're using your Gen AI to search for things and ask for things, you start to see the gaps, or how having 14 different variations on a description of the same thing creeps in to your answers. So rather than go, oh no, this doesn't work, go, oh good, this is highlighting for us all the areas where we could standardize, which then frees up these brilliant scientists and medical writers and clinicians to focus on knowledge capture, writing the unique, the new, the content that we don't have today because we're too busy copying and pasting and kind of rewriting and shading this and making that a summary of this other thing. We have an entire module to summarize and look across a lot of information so that the humans reading it on the other end can get just the summary that they need and only deep dive to the deep dives they need to do. And I think it would be interesting if we're thinking we're going to have machines write the summaries and machines parse the summaries. That doesn't make any sense. But if we start having this idea of this is our source knowledge and our source data, we can then map that information, whether it's to documents or other types of outputs, and not spend a lot of time in those middle stages of copy, paste, and production. There, I'll get off my soapbox now.
Also, if we imagine the Todd and Adrina's presentation, you write a protocol and you have your tags, and then if you have all your studies stored in USDM, simply like when you type code or something, you have this automation completion with all these fancy systems that you have these days. You could think of something that it will present a list of in an exclusion criteria that's already there that you could pick from when writing. If you add that tag, for instance, that could be a scenario, I think. Johannes, you were saying?
No, I was just going to add as well that we need to stop thinking about the protocol as a document. It's a database from now on, and that makes our lives much easier. And just like Regina said, we are going to release time to spend on more valuable tasks in our protocol writing. And that is going to be helped by having this database rather than a Word document where people are trying to squeeze in information that is not really meant for being put in a Word document.
Great, thanks everybody for that. I mean, I'm glad I asked that question too. We got a lot of good discussion out of that. I think we've got time for one more question, and it's another topic which we get asked about a lot, and it goes like this: the trial design domains are often the most challenging domains to develop in SDTM, particularly for novel study designs. How can Transcelerate or CDISC help the user community in setting up the study design appropriately in USDM? I want to put this to the panel in general, but I want Chris Deck, if you could give an initial response to that, this being a CDISC standard.
It's interesting because this kind of was created for this need to try to explain. Again, this goes back to what we just talked about, right? We've sat here and manually transcribed information out of a document and put it into a database, right? Now, I'm loosely using the domains as a database. It's a set of data sets, but the reality is this is a perfect example of what we shouldn't do, right? And we created these data sets because 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we needed that information in a way we could process it. So we came up with that at the time, right? Was let's create some data sets that we could feed in. But when we say feed in, it was all manual. It was reading the protocol and then transcribing it to that. The idea of this needs to go away, right? In fact, in the future, you might actually not have the trial design data sets anymore in the variation they are, because that trial design information is sitting there in that, as Johannes said, right? That database, that study design database. So what we're looking at with our new initiative called CDISC 360i is how to take the digital protocol information and really drive the automation downstream of our other standards. And the idea, the first step here, because we're not going to get rid of the trial design domains tomorrow, but the reality is we should be able to automate this. Like having to build these the way we do today should go away, just disappear. And they should be generated. Now, we have to test all those novel trial designs, right, to make sure we're capturing everything we need. But yeah, that was an example of a stopgap 15 years ago. And now we have a better solution as we go forward.
Yeah, thanks,
I don't know if
Chris.
others would add to that.
Yeah. Any
Yeah, but I
final
also think I think the USM has so much more detailing in the whole timeline, and the way that the timeline is related to the arms and elements. You can be much more specific in terms of modeling it in USM rather than doing in those SDTM domains that just have these columns about how it started and how it ended, and sometimes makes it hard for people to understand. But I think in USM you have much more specificity in the way that you can describe your real design.
Great, thank you, Kirsten. I think looking at time, I think this brings us about the end of the webinar today. So I'd like to extend a huge, enormous thank you to all of our panel participants today, Kirsten, Johannes, Todd, Regina, and Chris, for your excellent and insightful presentations and the discussions that we've just had around the various questions that were posed to us. You'll see on the screen, we just flashed up a closing slide with a little bit more information on some of the tools and resources we have available as part of DDF. So please feel free to take advantage of these to further your understanding of the DDF initiative. And it will supplement the handout that I pointed to earlier when we started the webinar with additional links and information. So on that note, I'd like to conclude. I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and we look forward to seeing you all at the next Solution Showcase. Thank you very much.